We're going to start by saying our names and the ages of our children. We're going to go down the line to introduce ourselves. And we're going to start.
I'm showing the name of the Conard PTO president, but my name is Manuela Conard. I have a freshman college student, and I also have a ninth grader in college.
I'm Jessica Goldstein. I'm the moderator. I have a sophomore and a junior, so I'm learning a lot.
My name is Julia Sauter. I have a freshman in college who graduated from Conard last year.
Hi, my name is Anna Park. I have a freshman in college and a junior in college. Both my girls graduated from Conard.
I'm Margaret Drolet. Oh, I'm muted. There we go. I'm Margaret Drolet. I have a freshman in college who graduated last year from Conard, and I have a current senior at Conard.
My name is Kristen Mangini. I'm a school counselor here at Conard, but I also have a senior and a freshman.
Hi, I'm Andy Hale, and we have a freshman at Conard as well as a senior at Conard. Thank you.
We're glad you're here. Okay, panelists, can we lower the volume on our laptops?
Everybody it's up on the top bar.
It's up on the top left. We're trying an experiment for a hybrid meeting. There's a lot of echo.
It's the bottom right.
Yeah. There it is.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, we're going to try again. Oh, it sounds better.
Yes.
All right, good work. So I am here to moderate the discussion. If you have a question as a viewer, please put that question into the chat, and we'll work through the questions in the room, the questions across the panel, and the questions in the chat. Our first question is about making a list. So can you tell us about how you balance your child's ideas about making their lists for their college list and your thoughts about where they should be going to school?
You want me to?
Sure.
I really let my daughter drive the train. I had some ideas of places she should look, and she agreed to look at them, but then didn't really like what I suggested, so she came up with some other ideas, and really the place she wound up was all her, 100% her. It was never on my radar screen at all, which is she's at Tulane in New Orleans. And I just assumed she would be here in New England somewhere, and she's not. So I think letting your kids drive the train is important. But I also think that as parents, we have some things that we control, like what we'll pay for and what we can afford to pay for. And so I do think it's important that that conversation is had with kids really early in the process so that they don't find themselves falling in love with something that's just not realistic. And that I think is probably the most important. If you can help your kid to target the right group of schools for affordability, then no one's heart is broken.
Does anyone have anything else to add to that? That was a great explanation.
Yeah, that was a really, and I will second have the money conversation early and often. My son drove pretty much everything, but he was really good at keeping me updated. I would sometimes ask him questions about why he was dropping a school or adding a school. He did musical theater, which means you have to apply to a lot of schools because they accept a very small number of kids. But But he was really good about researching and keeping me updated. And I will say where he ended up, neither one of us expected him there, and it was the absolute best place for him. So a couple of people on our college tours said, we find most people end up exactly in the school where they should be. And so it was true for him. So.
That's great.
I can just add. Great. So I think the only thing I'll add is that neither of my children knew what they wanted to study, so that didn't help with the narrowing down of the schools at all. And I think that's where the school did a really great job with my kids of kind of, listening to what their needs were, what their wants were in terms of school size and various other factors, and helping them to also narrow that list a little bit. And then we went and visited a few schools on the list and narrowed it down further from there.
And if I can just add from the school counselor perspective, I think often students think they have a type of school, so they want their list to kind of match. Well, I can't apply to this really big school because I'm applying to this really small school. That is not the case. You can find a fit in different institutions that might be very different from one another. It's just visiting, seeing what boxes they do check, and not getting locked into that there's this one school for me. I think in the end you'll have a lot to choose from, but there's a lot of factors that have to come into play. So your list can be very diverse, and that's okay.
Thanks, Kristen. Let's talk about getting started. When is the best time to start to look at schools? And are there downsides to starting too early?
I actually think we are a COVID era, and after freshman year, I made my daughter go see 4 schools, and boy, am I glad I did that, because we never saw another school. It was too early, but I'm glad I did it. And I think that we did one intentional school trip. We went to New York and saw some things in upstate New York. And then we did 2 schools when we were on vacation, so they didn't feel as, purposeful. But she definitely, because she had been on some campuses and had been on those campuses, not just like walking through them because her cousin was there or something, but was there thinking, oh, could I see myself here? I think it was very helpful to her to know what the atmosphere is like at Dartmouth which is one of the schools we visited. And I think that helped her to focus herself later when it actually mattered. So my advice would be, if you're going to be on a trip and you're going to go past Skidmore or go past, the University of Delaware, drive through, take your kids, say, let's walk around and let's see this. It may not be what they want, but it gets kids thinking about the future, I feel like. And particularly if you have a kid that, maybe is struggling a little bit in high school, I think if they can see what the future is, it can focus them. And then they might feel like, oh, it's worth working a little harder so that I can get to this place. So I feel like you can't start too early. That's just my personal view.
I had a little bit of a different experience, also a COVID kid, but I have 2. I couldn't get my kids to get into the idea of going to visit colleges that early. So I would say, don't stress out if you're like, let's go, and they're like, no, because it's okay. There's a lot of other ways to visit schools. We did a lot of virtual visits online, which were very, very valuable. And we probably didn't start going to visit schools until junior year with my kids. So I don't think it's ever too early. I don't think you should stress if you feel like it's getting late.
I agree with that.
So I will just add my freshman in college, Declan, he and I did a couple of road trips, and it was very bonding. But he was very into kind of checking out as many schools as he could. He actually applied to 16 different schools, and we couldn't really see even half of them. And it was COVID, so we saw a lot of ghost campuses where nobody was there because kids were doing classes online. But it was good just to see it, and it was a great time to spend that time together. With my current senior, he's already locked in through baseball, but every time we were going anywhere, like summer vacation or to go visit relatives or whatever, we would just find a school nearby and at least just do I think it gives them, it may not be the school they love, but it's a point of reference, and they can say, oh, I don't really want that, I'm pretty sure. Oh, I want to find a school that has that, and I think that's very helpful.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit more about your role as a parent during the campus visit. Did you ask a lot of questions? Did your children ask questions? Are there anything that we should have other parents paying attention to on the visits?
Okay. Your kids are not going to even want to be associated with you on the visits. So, like, pretend you're not, like, hang back, let them go. Do not talk to them at all during the visits. They will just roll their eyes at you. Although I did make one comment during the visit that made the other parents laugh. And then when we went back for her honors weekend orientation, 2 moms found me and said, you're the one that made that funny comment. And I said to my daughter, I said, see, I'm a rock star here. I'm the cool one. And she said, Mom, I can't believe people remember that. It wasn't that funny. But anyway, yeah, I totally do not associate with your kid during the visits, I have to say. Life will be much better if you don't talk about it afterwards either. Like, let them, don't get in the car and be like, what'd you think? What'd you think?
Yeah.
Let them, go get a sandwich, go have a cup of coffee, don't really say anything. They will start to tell you about it on the drive home. But again, let them decide when it's right for them to talk about it.
I would just say the college visits are very thorough. So there's probably not going to be a whole ton of questions that you'll have after you've finished a college tour. They really do a great job. I did, unlike Julia, ask a couple of questions, but I did it kind of on the slide. Like so the way they typically do it is they'll break the larger group into smaller groups, and so you'll have a person for every, let's say, 10 people. And so when we were walking from place to place, I would kind of like go up to the tour guide and say, so, blah, 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 blah. So that was kind of how I approached it.
We didn't get to have real tour guides. It was so COVID shut down by the time we were looking. But we would go to some info sessions online, and we did get to see a couple schools in person, and they are very informative. And some schools even would separate the kids from the parents and to alleviate the horror of my mother speaking up. So that was good. For the most part, I let him kind of, just if I was curious about something.
I just want to clarify a point. So there's college tours, which you often go on to get a feel for the campus. Those are usually student-led. There's a student ambassador on campus. And I think there's room for questions, but I think it is best to kind of have the student take the lead and just absorb it without being like, oh my gosh, my parent is speaking, this is embarrassing. But then I think when you really are finalizing your list, there's open houses, which are different. And I think that's where you really do have the opportunity to ask a lot of questions, because those are more of a full day, and you sign up for different sessions where you can expand your knowledge about the school. And it's also appropriate for you to say, okay, you want to go listen to this, but I'm, as mom, I'm going to go to this info session. Like, you don't have to sit with your child in the same sessions. It's almost better to split up in those open houses and say, could you please just take a few notes so you can have something to talk to me about, but you don't have to be together. So don't feel pressure on the tour to ask a ton of questions, knowing if this is really a top runner, you should try to attend the open house, or you can independently as a parent sign up for a lot of the virtual info sessions that mirror those sessions that are at the open house in person.
That's a great clarification. I have a follow-up question as the rookie mom. Are there good questions to ask in these info sessions or tours or visits, or specific things that you feel like you were looking out for when you went to different schools?
I think the kids are probably more concerned with, do I have my own bathroom in the dorm? Whereas as parents, we're more concerned with things like, how many semesters is it going to take for my kid to graduate with a double major? Or, what kind of health care is available if they get sick? We have different priorities than they do. I always think academic related questions are good questions to ask, because whether or not they have their own bathroom is really inconsequential to whether that's the right school for them. But it is important to know, is there a core curriculum, and what does that mean in terms of, AP credits, and are those going to count for the core classes? And, if they want a double major, what does that mean? Is there any way that they can double major in minor? Those are the questions. It's not so easy to find those answers on the website. And I think that if your kid is really focused on a particular area, academic questions and meeting with departments and going to presentations for departments is really important. If you're like Anna and me with kids that are a little bit more general and not sure what they want to do, I think it's also important to know what the opportunities are for kids that don't know what they want to do, because not every kid knows what they want to do. And so I was very focused on academic stuff when I was, as the parent participating. I never asked the questions, but I listened when the tour guides talked about their academic experience, because that's what I was interested in.
Anyone have anything else to add there?
I will just add, my current senior, baseball is his big thing, and that's what's drawn him to the school he's going to. But I was very concerned about how they keep the athletes academically tuned in and doing well. And the schools I really liked had a real solid program of monitoring their grades, requiring they go to study sessions, assigning people to help them with whatever they need. And that was something I was very concerned about, and they were very good with the answers and the information. So.
Do you have to answer the questions in the chat as they come up, or?
Would you like to do that, or should we wait?
It's your show.
Oh, that's my show.
Maybe
great.
As they come up?
Yeah, maybe we'll say now.
All right, I'm going to answer this question because it is more very specific. So the question is it best to apply early decision, and what exactly does that mean? No, it is not best to apply early decision. Early decision is a binding contract with the school that if they accept you, you will attend. So we have actually very few early decision applications that leave Conard, which it doesn't mean they're unheard of. But what you are saying to that school is you are willing to make a commitment blind to what their financial aid package would be. Therefore, very few families are comfortable enough to make that statement to a school. There is something called early action, which is not a commitment. The school simply offers an earlier deadline than their regular, and you would apply to that earlier deadline so that you would hear sooner than like early spring. And that's a great alternative. I think statistically speaking, there is an advantage to applying early decision because their acceptance rate within that pool of students is higher. But again, you're making a huge commitment. And then early action, I think there is a little bit of a slightly higher acceptance rate compared to regular decision, but not huge. And also that depends from school to school. So, and then there's something called rolling admission, which is a school that doesn't really have a set deadline, but they make decisions as the applications are received within 1 to 3 weeks. So they don't wait for a specific date to start reviewing applications and making decisions. So that's something that you really want to talk about with your school counselor, because it also plays a lot into your student's academic situation. So there are students now, like as seniors, that kind of hit their stride at end of junior year, and we might say, hold off, don't apply early action, because we really want you to secure your semester 1 senior grades to show that growth again before putting your application out there. So there's different aspects to all of those deadlines.
Thank you. We have follow-ups on that?
I have a follow-up. If your kid is like 100%, I want to go to this school, then I would assume you would want to do the early decision?
Again, if you are comfortable enough making a financial commitment to the school, that let's say you look at their, I have to unmute myself, sorry. So the question was, if your student is fairly certain that they want to go to a specific school, that is a family decision. What you can do is every college and university is required to have what's called a net price calculator on their site. So what you can do is go in to their site in the search bar, type in net price calculator. It'll ask you a series of questions about your financial situation, and then it gives you a fairly accurate guesstimate as to what that institution would provide you. And that, I think, if you look at that number and can comfortably say we can swing that for 4 years, then early decision might be right for you.
These questions connect nicely to our next question on our list, and that question is, how much did you share with your child about the financial realities of applying to college?
We were very blunt and honest about it, and we did start at 529 like when I was pregnant, so we had put away a fair amount, although it's a lot less than it was, and so we're a little concerned that we can't do 4 years right now, so we need the market to go up. But yeah, I mean, we talked about it a lot with her, and so, but we still pushed her not to do early decision, because that's the other thing. If you're at a school that does award merit money, early decision, they've got you. They don't need to give you merit money to get you to come. And so we did early action, and she got a merit award, and she got a merit award from another school, and I called them and I got them to increase her merit award at Tulane, where she really wanted to go, based on the other merit award she'd gotten. So it's not, this is the offer, take it or leave it. I'm telling you that. You can call them and you can negotiate. But you have to have something in hand to do it. So we did early action, and it worked out in our favor.
So I have 2 children, 2 years apart. So I learned a little bit from my first child. I think I harped a lot on the financial piece, probably too much, because then I heard my child saying, well, I can't apply here, this school's too expensive. And I realized afterwards that I probably should have, while you certainly want them to apply to schools that are appropriate for you financially, you don't necessarily know what you're going to get for financial aid. So I did less of that with my second child. Again, be reasonable, but, I did encourage her to apply to some schools that were probably out of our financial reach, that I thought were out of our financial reach. The other thing I would say is there is a lot of money, and this is, I'm sure, part of another piece, but there's a lot of money out there. Conard has a fantastic, high school guidance department has a fantastic website that lists all sorts of scholarship opportunities, and they have tabs for every month, application deadlines, when they're due, links to the applications. And although my kids and I argued a lot about how many essays they had to write for these applications, they did get a lot of the scholarships. So, keep that in mind when you're looking at schools that are out of your reach. There's a lot of opportunities for funding out there. Even if you don't think you qualify, a lot of them they're not all need-based scholarships.
I just needed them to understand that I wasn't probably going to be able to cover everything and that I wouldn't discourage them from looking at a more expensive school, but they would have to really understand what college debt and college loans mean, and what people are living with even in their 30s, 40s to get that paid off. But what we did was we kind of, with the offers and what we find out with the scholarships, and I have the college funds too, we looked at where they wanted to go, and I said, well, if you want to go here, we can probably get most of it done because you got a really good offer. If you want to go to this other school, you're going to have to carry debt, and if that's okay with you, and you really clearly understand that, then okay, I'll support that, and I will try to help you best I can. And I think it gave them they never really understand, it's like, no, you don't really know what's going to be a parent, but you can't describe it. But I think they have a good enough understanding that, and they both ended up going to places that I think they're really probably not going to have to carry too much. And so that worked out. I lost sleep for years and years and years not knowing how to pay for college, but it turns out you get the aid, you get the scholarships, you get the merit, and somehow you make it happen. So.
Any questions about that from the group here? No? Good. Okay. We're going to dial it back to the application process. Tell us about how much you helped your child with their essays and their activity lists and their supplemental essays.
I have to make a confession. I do this professionally. So I did help my daughter a fair amount, although only more as an editor. But I was really on her about deadlines, like, by this date you have to have this done. Kristen was great. She was, my daughter was pretty organized. And she only applied to 5 schools. That's the other thing. Some kids do apply to a lot because of what they're interested in. And so when you have more schools, you have more essays. We didn't have a ton of extra essays. We had like maybe 8 or 10. And some of them you can reuse. You write it for one and then you tweak it for school 2. So I am not a last minute person. So I did not want her on Halloween saying, oh my God, we got to get the applications done. To me, October 15th was the deadline for November 1st. And luckily, Conard is really good about that too. This is something to know. They push the kids to make decisions, like to let them know well in advance of what deadlines they have. And so the kids realize, oh, I guess if Conard's not doing it at the last minute, maybe I shouldn't do it at the last minute either. And so we were, I was pretty firm with her about like, you have to have this done by this date and this done by this date. And I'm happy to look it over, but you need to be ready to submit by this time. And part of that is that, everybody's submitting at the last minute. And I know a kid who this weekend had a problem submitting something on Common App because Common App was overwhelmed. And they had to log back in later in the day, and luckily it worked. But this was on Sunday when the deadline was Tuesday, and everybody was submitting this weekend. So you really do want to push your kids to think that the deadline is sooner than it is. So, I hear about parents that have zero involvement, and then I hear about parents that are way over involved. I think there's a happy medium somewhere. Sometimes kids don't want you to be involved, and you just have to honor that and hope that they let someone look at their essays and someone look at their grammar in the activities section. Because I will say, particularly at more selective schools, people read that activity section. They want to get information out of it. So they're expecting it to make sense and actually reflect a description of what the kid did. And so, kids don't always understand that, and they just whip stuff out, and that's not particularly helpful. So if you can convince them to let you look at it, that would be great, or someone. It doesn't have to be you, but maybe there's an older sibling or someone that could look at it, a neighbor, a friend that's a teacher, something.
So I was actually surprised at how much of the application they actually do in school.
Yes.
I thought I would have to be way more involved, and I really didn't have to be very involved. I helped edit the essay, but really the teachers in school, the language arts teachers, helped with the essay as well, initially getting it going, and do kind of the initial edits. So really, a lot of it was done in school. Julia actually helped look at one of my child's essays, so that was also very helpful. But yeah,
I think
support they had in school.
Yeah, we should point out that in their senior fall they have senior planning, and that really, that is when my daughter did her application. She would do it in senior planning, and then say, "Oh, can you check this? I did it today." And so, if they take advantage of senior planning, you're not doing this stuff at home. It's done.
Can I take this opportunity just to talk a little bit about our curriculum in the school counseling department? So we kind of start scaffolding this process with students sophomore year. So in the spring, March or April, depending on when the English teachers let us in, we do a 3-day series with all sophomores that starts out as career research, because not that you have to know your major to apply to college, but you should know like 3 to 4 fields, so that when you are looking at schools, you're looking at schools that have those fields, so you're less likely to have to transfer. And then the second day is looking at colleges that offer pathways in those fields. And then the third day is talking about the resume, because the last thing you want to be is a senior saying, oh my gosh, I didn't know there was a resume. So it's to encourage them to get involved early on. In grade 11, third quarter, we have a 10-week junior workshop. So that's actually when they create their common application. So the common application is basically an online application that can be sent to many, many schools. Not every school, but a good amount. Over the course of those 10 weeks, we tackle different aspects of the application process. We talk about interview skills. We just talk about organizational process, testing, how to determine if a school requires testing, and all of those pieces. And throughout the junior workshop, parents get a Friday weekly update, so you know exactly what we did each week to open up that conversation. So my advice in terms of how often to talk about it, don't, and then open your Friday email, and at some point over the weekend be like, oh, I saw this, and just have a quick nap. You have to read your child as well. Some, that's all they want to talk about. Others, it's, if you're getting the sense that it's overwhelming them, just ask pointed questions and know that they're talking about it on a weekly basis in those workshops. And then senior year, they're in a 6-week senior workshop where they are finishing up the process. For some students, it's less than 6 weeks, because we have a checklist that we have them follow at the beginning of the workshop. And if you do finish earlier than those 6 weeks, you can be dismissed and get your free period back. But we go through that checklist with them also individually in a one-on-one. So they're getting the classroom environment in the fall of senior year, but then every senior has a one-on-one meeting with their counselor where they customize the checklist to their list of schools, their major, their programs. And then that checklist is emailed home to families, so that, again, that prompts that natural conversation. Like, oh, Mrs. Mangini sent me this, so this is my to-do. Because we type in notes and give you kind of some direction so that you almost have to talk about it. So we really do try to sequence things so that it reduces the stress and opens the lines of communication for families so that they don't have to be super involved. But to that point, as a mom to a senior now, I'm way more involved than I ever thought I would be, but each student's different. So just doing what you have to do to make sure the process goes along, but giving them that grace to try to do it on their own. And then the scholarship piece. That is something that we share out to families as well. There's a lot of unclaimed money that is out there. So really making that like a weekend to-do list, because that spreadsheet is updated as we receive information. It's a live document. So it's not something you can pull up once and say, okay, these are the scholarships I'm applying to, or you're missing out. As we receive them, update that by due date.
And can I just add? I'll just add that there are a couple of them, at least a couple, that are for juniors specifically. So don't think you have to be a senior to apply.
I'm going to throw out something because I wish someone had talked to me about it. SAT score is optional. How do you have a choice?
So test optional, that is grown due to COVID. It was always out there. There is a site called fairtest.org to see which schools are test optional, and that's just ever growing. Some are starting to say we are test optional until, because they're now putting a cap on that. I think the rule of thumb is what we state to students is if you look at their advertised averages and your SAT score is at or above go ahead and send. If they are test optional, sometimes they're not test optional, and even if you're below, you have to share your test scores. But if the school is test optional and your score is not at or above, then I would withhold it. You have to read the fine print for each school though, because there are schools that are test optional for admission, but not test optional for merit and scholarship aid. So you may be hurting yourself if you're kind of teetering between, I'm kind of right at the average, but I'm not going to send my scores, then you almost disqualified yourself with any potential money that your GPA could have afforded you. So I think it's really just doing your homework and looking at the individual schools' policies. But again, that's something we share out with the students, and it varies from school to school, major to major. Some schools are test optional in general, but their nursing and engineering programs are not. So you have to really read the individual sites of the schools to see what test optional means to them. Some schools we're seeing, if you go test optional, you have to write an additional essay. So it really is just reading the fine print as to what their definition of test optional is.
And I would add that some schools that have been test optional have seen such an increase in applications that they are putting the test scores back in. Tennessee and Georgia are two that have put test scores back in because they just can't do 90,000 applications, and that's sort of where they were headed. So, you really need to look by school as to whether or not they're going to be test optional for your application year.
You have questions in the room?
You ever recommend someone take the SAT and the ACT to see which they're better on?
Absolutely. The question, I'm not sure if everyone can hear through here, so I'm going to repeat it. There's also something called the ACT used for college admissions as well, and they're used interchangeably. So oftentimes students do take both, and you could send in both if they're kind of in alignment with one another, but you could also opt to just send one over the other if the score is significantly higher. Yeah, definitely.
Great. This is just a follow-up about essay writing and supplemental essay writing. There are some parent volunteers on the PTO who have offered their time to review essays. So to anyone in the audience here or online, if you have a child in need of support, you can contact the PTO directly or contact the guidance counselors, and they'll get in touch with the PTO if you need that support. So we're cycling through the process here. We've applied to college, we thought about our list, and now we have all the information back. Can you tell us about the process of picking your school once you received all of your acceptance letters and your merit packages?
Yeah, you guys are better.
A lot of schools on our list. So we literally made a spreadsheet and just kind of, here's what it is, financially. Honestly, that played a big role in our decision. I have one in-state and one out-of-state. So obviously the out-of-state school is significantly more expensive. So we really just kind of made a spreadsheet with, all of kind of the top 10, let's say, criteria that they were looking for to see which school best met. We hadn't actually visited all the schools that my kids applied to, so we used that opportunity then to actually go visit some of the schools where we got some financial aid, and maybe that was going to be a school that we would want to attend. So that was kind of how we did it. And then, they talk a lot with their friends too. My kids happened to want to go to schools where none of their friends were going. Like that was just, they wanted to they love high school, but they wanted an opportunity to go somewhere just different. A lot of different factors, but just having that conversation and kind of looking at, apples to apples is really important.
With the musical theater kids, there's the added bonus of auditions. So it was a bit of a more involved process, but as we started to hear, so you would have like callbacks, so sometimes you'd have 2 or 3 auditions before you even found out if you got into school. So as we would hear back from schools, he would kind of have a running list about where was the top and whatever. And he came home and said, I got in, and I had no idea which one he was talking about, and it was the University of Cincinnati, and that had never even been one he even talked about. And just the look on his face, like we both knew, well, let's get the financial info in, and we got really lucky, and that was it. Like, it was kind of weird. But like I said, he's definitely where he belongs. So.
Mine was a little less. I mean, Tulane was her first choice. She applied early action. She got in. We did not let her commit because we wanted to negotiate more money. And so once we did that and then got an increased award, we said go ahead and commit. And so it was like she didn't even care about hearing from other places. In fact, she withdrew one of her applications because she thought, well, maybe someone else wants to go there and I don't want to take that spot. So it was a small school. So she didn't even hear from one of the schools she applied to. So.
And I just want to clarify one thing. Julia brings up a good point. You're going to hear from your schools over a stretched out period of time, depending on whether they're an early action school, a rolling school, or like UConn. You won't know till March. I often, like this past weekend, I got an email from a student that was like, oh my gosh, I got accepted. I really love this school. I think I'm going to commit. And I had to quickly write back, like on a Saturday morning, like, don't commit, don't do anything, because you don't know your financial packages. So it's really hard to hang on to some of these offers, because especially if it's a school you're really excited about, but you can negotiate the financial aid piece. So even if it is your absolute favorite, wait until you've heard from everybody so you can leverage all the information. And you're not going to lose your spot. Once they offer you an acceptance, you have until May 1st. That is the universal commit date. So it's a long wait if you find out in November, but it's worth that wait oftentimes to hold off and get all of the information before committing.
Well, and one thing I would add, at some of the schools where there's a housing crunch, you might get in and you might get this like urgent email, like, oh, you have to send your deposit today because you're not going to get housing. You can send a housing deposit and realize that you might forfeit that $175 without committing to the spot in the class. You can just send a housing deposit so it's separate. Like if you're going to the University of Texas or Texas A&M or one of these really big schools where they do not have enough housing for students, it is like the date that you get your housing deposit in gets you priority in terms of housing. So that's just something to know, that the housing deposit does not reflect a commitment to go to the school.
Those are questions.
Oh, sure.
How do they notify you if you get financial aid or scholarship or merit?
That's a good
Does
question.
my son have to be reading his emails all the time?
Yes.
Yes.
That's
We get
scary.
a lot by regular mail.
It really varies from school to school. So once you apply, do you want to answer this?
Yeah, I
I
mean,
want to take over.
once you apply, you're going to get an email. And that email is going to provide the student with a link to create a portal. And that portal is then their interface with that school. And they need to check their portal periodically. And so financial aid is usually listed in the portal. And now our merit award came in our offer letter. But then when we renegotiated, it reflected in the portal and not in the offer letter. So your student needs to be checking their email. Like that is critical. And another thing I will tell you, if they're really interested in a school and they're getting a lot of email from the school, they need to be opening that email and clicking on the links, because the schools can see all of that. They can see how long a student interacts with one of their emails. So they look at that. I will tell you that from the inside. That is looked at and they know. So encourage your kids, once they've developed a list of schools they're excited about, to interact with those schools.
Yeah, like right down to visits, phone calls, participating in the online. They literally do track. I think they have files on what they participated in, and they really want kids who show that they're really interested in the school. Like that actually surprised me. But
They look for, it's called demonstrated interest. So they kind of check off, did you visit? Did you attend any virtual info sessions? Did you come to open house? Did you show up at Conard when we were there? So we host info sessions here where the representatives come to our career center, and we really drive the point home that they're here in your building. It doesn't get any easier. You can't not show up. And if you're not going to show up because you have a physics test or something like that, email and say, I am aware you were here and your school is very important to me. My teacher wouldn't let me make up my exam. Like I had to be in class, but I visited, and then you kind of list off what you've done to kind of interact with the school.
Hi. To that point about emails, one suggestion we were given was to make a separate email account for college stuff. So just to sort out which is another thing to manage, but it just is a way to do it. Potentially.
it's not a bad idea.
Do you want to take that question?
The chat?
That
Sure.
would be great.
Okay, so the question in the chat, is it really necessary for students to go to private schools like BU, NYU versus UConn or a public institution to get a better education or opportunity? In other words, do you really think a $60K a year school, when schools like UConn, known as a public Ivy, seem more sensible, affordable? Is it more what they do when they are there, no matter what the college they go to? My daughter originally had her heart set on a private school and then saw the pricing, thought it was more sensible to do undergraduate at UConn. So that really is a family decision. The obvious answer is the private schools have a larger ticket price, but I have seen some of those private institutions through scholarship and so on be the same price as UConn. So that's where you have to kind of go into this process with an open mind and do have those honest and real conversations about, here's what we can afford, here are the schools that we know will likely come in around that number, but here, based on your GPA and your rigor and all of those pieces, here are some schools that you might, that are private, that check a lot of the boxes for you, that might come through with money. So I think there's no simple answer to that question. That there's no doubt that UConn's a great institution. We're very lucky to have them, but each family has to decide. Some students are very intimidated by the size of UConn, therefore they're looking for a smaller, more private experience. So it's just, there's no right or wrong. I think everyone has to find their fit financially, academically, socially, all of those pieces.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think I was that parent that was discouraging my child from applying to private schools because I was really worried about the cost. But a lot of these schools have large endowments, and you'd be surprised at how much financial aid you can get. So I kind of switched it to, just because you're applying to a school doesn't mean you're going to go to that school. So, apply. Sure, there's no harm in applying, and then let's see how the numbers shake out.
I'm going to go backwards, sorry, but I was just thinking about the application process and how hard it was for my daughter to talk about herself and to promote herself and to kind of brag. Like there's a little brag sheet that they're supposed to write, yeah? So is there advice about like getting your kid to be comfortable with that whole self-promotion piece that is part of this process, because you have to put yourself out there? And then my two part to this is about the rejection side of things. And when you end up getting rejected from schools, and we can say that, but but so what about like that, getting them to really like put it out there? Because it's hard. It's hard to talk about yourself as a grown-up, much less your kids who are just still figuring themselves out.
Do you want me to answer that?
Margaret,
I was just going to say, I think the essays are a chance for the schools to really understand who your child is. And it isn't, I know some of the bragging is probably good to get in there, but I think it's really more about who are they, what are they looking for, what do they bring to that community, and it doesn't have to be that you were a super rock star at sports or like a straight A student at whatever, but maybe you're fascinated with saving the planet, or your passion is animals, or whatever it is, and they get an insight into who you are. Maybe it's easier for her to talk about that than more about, hey, I'm really great because, you know.
I tend to agree. I mean, I think it is hard to talk about yourself, and I just don't think college essays need to be this big ballooning self-promotion thing. They can be a very small moment in time that captures your essence and how you react to something and how it made you feel in that moment. The important part about the essays is that it be about them. I read an essay the other day that a kid wrote about their mother, and they were very flattering and really admiring their mother, which was great, but I didn't learn a lot about the kid in that essay. And I thought, oh, this is a missed opportunity because I know a lot about your mom, but I don't know much about you. So it's really important that the essay be about them and not like they went to Israel and they had an opportunity to sort of see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict firsthand. That's a good subject to write about, but don't write about the plane trip to Israel. Talk about being on the ground, who you met, how it made you feel. Just bring it back to them and make it be reflective of them and who they are.
And I do think the brag sheets are very helpful because sometimes you feel that way about yourself, but once you put all the things down on paper and you say, wow, I really have accomplished a lot, and the child gets to do one of those and the parent also gets to do one of those. So I think it is very helpful to kind of list all the wonderful things about you.
There's some things you talked about that I feel like my daughter never told me about. I was just realizing I wasn't as looped in. So can I just throw also out the idea of the rejection piece, because that happens, and I know there's a culture around it. We're very much tied to like the kids are, did you get in? Did you, where are you going? Blah, 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 blah. And so I just think if there's any advice, I know it's just something you kind of go through, but if anybody has advice about it.
Kristen, did you want to finish up on the self-promotion bit?
Sorry.
We'll do that, and then maybe you can pivot to the rejection.
Yes. So we do ask them here at Conard to do a lot of self-promotion, okay? The application itself, if you think about the structure of it, it's very factual. Even the activities section, which is where you would kind of itemize your resume, it doesn't give you a ton within that Common App tab to really elaborate. If you make a resume, a separate document, some schools will allow you to upload that, which gives more detail. But the brag sheet that you're referring to, we actually changed the name of it because it made so many kids uncomfortable. It's the recommendation reflection. We actually use it internally. No one sees it other than the school counselor. And it's just to make sure that there aren't, because not every student is full disclosure. They don't come knock on their school counselor's door and tell us everything. Either they're just not comfortable doing that, or it's just private and not something they want to share. But if the premise of us putting these reflections out there is that there may be something that I, as your school counselor, didn't walk through with you, but you can share it with me and I can convey it in your recommendation, because your essay is 650 words. You can't write about every aspect of yourself in that essay or it just won't flow nicely. So you want to focus your essay on what you feel is most telling about you. But then the brag sheets that you're talking about, the reflections, we use as school counselors to make sure the structure of our letter isn't leaving out something fairly large that the student has gone through or experienced. Because the counselor letter is one of the few items that is really all-encompassing, because we talk about academics, extracurriculars, personal circumstance, all of those things. The teacher letter is designed to talk about your ability as a student to analyze things, to ask questions, to engage with your peers. That's very scripted, is what the admissions offices are looking for from a teacher rec. Your essay has to be pretty specific. So The recommendation reflections are really just an opportunity for students to disclose things to us that they would not mind shared in their letter. So that's written in bold at the top. Please don't put something in this recommendation reflection that you wouldn't want me to convey to schools in your letter of recommendation. So that kind of just to explain. So there's a student one and a parent one as well when you log into your Naviance account. In terms of rejections, so they're going to happen. It's unavoidable. So we try to say that in our workshops over and over again, like your list needs to run the spectrum in terms of reach, which are schools where your academic profile is below what those schools are looking for in terms of their averages. Then your target schools is where you kind of fall right in the middle of what they're looking at. And then your safety schools is where your profile is higher than their average accepted student. And when we go through that list in their one-on-one, or as we receive their requests, we try to be very clear with them, like, great, shoot for the stars. But if I'm meeting with a student and it seems like the majority of their schools are reaches, I will be reaching out and putting it in the notes of the checklist saying, please add more target and safety schools to your list. So we try to not prevent the rejections, but prepare mentally that the rejection is always a possibility, especially in this climate. It's getting increasingly competitive, but there is going to be a place for everybody. And I do see some students who have their heart set on a school from the get-go. And when they are rejected, it is devastating, especially with that social piece where you have peers that did. And then sometimes, and just this from the inside, you have peers that got in and you're like, but how? I know, sometimes it doesn't even make sense. And then they come and they look for answers. So I think it's a process, and I think they will get through it, but there is no way of preventing it. And I think despite everybody's efforts, it's really hard to prepare them for it as well. Just working through it, but also making sure that that list has places where they do see themselves happy. Your safety shouldn't just be like, oh, by numbers, that's a safety school. You have to find things within that school that you are drawn to as well.
With the Common App and the no SAT scores, do the kids need to apply to more safety schools? Because I've been hearing that certain schools that kids thought were safety schools, the admissions department just assumes they might not be going there. Mm-hmm. Just because people are now applying to twice as many schools as they did before.
So that's where the demonstrated interest also comes into play, because if you are, yes, the answer to your question is we have students that are rejected from schools where on paper you're like, how did that happen? And because they think it's their safety, they give that school less attention. So it's important to give your safety schools that same attention and demonstrate your level of interest in that school. But when we do get, when students do get rejection letters that don't make sense, the school counselor does call the institutions, and not always, but there are times where it's, oh, we didn't think they wanted to come. And then when you explain, like, oh, yes, they absolutely are very interested, that isn't a commitment to the school, but that you would be interested in entertaining the idea of going there, it is sometimes overturned. So I don't think necessarily increasing the number of safety schools you apply to, it's just how you treat your safety schools.
Just to repeat that for the question that prompted that response for the online audience. So the question was, with the test optional approach to test scores and the increased use of the Common App, how do we manage the safety schools on our list? That was the question that led to that response. Do you have other questions from the audience?
Well, and one thing I would say about that is, one good thing about COVID is that the virtual opportunities at schools are like constant. You can do an online tour, you can do some schools have sessions just for parents. Like, if that's a school that's on your kid's list, even if they're not engaging in virtual stuff, If you sign up for the virtual, they get credit for it. Like, I did a lot of virtual stuff from the schools that my daughter was looking at. Like, my husband and I were at 7 o'clock, like every Wednesday night, we were on a virtual parent session. You don't have to fly to Miami to see the University of Miami. You can do as much virtual stuff as they offer, and that's, you know, that's just a few hours of your time. So I really encourage you to tell your kids that they've got to do a virtual session at least at every school that they're going to apply to that they haven't had a chance to visit. And it really is important. So.
How do they track that? With your address?
The question is, how do they track that?
I mean, do you have a common name or your parents have different names or?
Most colleges use a system called Slate, and when you sign up to do a virtual session, you put your name and your high school in, and usually your date of birth, okay. And then that creates a file in Slate. So you haven't applied yet, but then when you do apply, then it matches you with that, and
you register for. You register for all of your in-person stuff as well using that same identification information.
A final question for our panelists. What do you know now that you wish you knew back then when you were applying?
I guess I wish I knew that my daughter really wanted to go 1,000 miles away.
I would just, they're going to be really prepared for school. We have a great system here, and I think we hear that a lot from our students that they get to college and they're ready. So try not to stress out too much about the process. They'll figure it out. They'll get their applications, and one of my children is a very last minute, come on, we got to get these applications in, and she got them in and she did it. So I think try not to be too stressed out about the processes, I guess, kind of what I learned from one child to the other child.
Yeah, I think there were times when both my son and I were both terrified of what if you don't get in anywhere, and don't worry about that. They really are going to end up where they belong, and yeah, you're always convinced they're not going to get in that time, but they do. They figure it out. So I wish I had not stressed as much as I did. So yeah.
Thank you for that. We had one question in the chat that I had missed, and it's about interviewing. And it says, do the schools interview the kids or only small private schools interview? Can students request an interview, or is it all just on paper?
It varies from school to school. So some schools say, don't contact us, we'll contact you. So once you apply, you may be invited for an interview. Other schools have right on their website, you could sign up for in-person or virtual interviews. You get to select the time, the date. So it really, and then some schools we don't interview. So it really is just getting familiar with the individual school's policies and how that works. And what we say is, in the Google Classroom that we have with students, we post interview tips and possible questions. But I always say, if you have an interview coming up or several interviews coming up, set aside 20 minutes with your school counselor to just it's great for us to give you a lot of questions, but how you frame your answer, I think, is important. So give us 20 minutes just to kind of map out what we feel you should highlight and points you should leave left unsaid in your opportunity to have that face-to-face time.
And one thing I would say is the support at Conard is really good. We get private school level counseling services here. Your kid just needs to take advantage of them. And I've dealt with kids from other public schools. It's nothing like what we have here. And so they need to take their planning sessions seriously. They need to meet with their counselor. They need to follow up with their counselor when they have a question. The counselors will respond. they're gonna say, oh, no, I can't, like, they're too busy, or, no, I don't need to ask my counselor this, I know the answer. Just really encourage them to use their counselor, because we are very, very, very lucky at Conard, very lucky with the level of the counseling office, so.
Thank you. And I just want to put a plug in, sorry. So we make ourselves accessible to the students through all the workshops. We're in their face all the time, posting reminders in the Google Classroom. But since COVID, we've actually put some things in play for parents because it was very hard to do our normal evening presentations. So what we've done, just so you know what's coming down the pike for junior and senior parents, is we pre-record our sessions, and then we give you access to the Google Slides presentation with active links to things. So you could always go back to those presentations at any point and say, I forgot what they said, I'm gonna go rewatch that. But then we also have weekly Q&As that we actually partnered with Hall High School. So there's a counselor from Conard and a counselor from Hall at varying times throughout the week. So we have a 7:30, an 11, and a 1:30, trying to accommodate family schedules. And it's simply a Q&A. We're not presenting anything, but if you make a running list of questions you might have, you can hop in and actually have time with the school counselors to ask questions on a weekly basis. And then we've just introduced 3 in-person Q&A sessions as well. So we're trying to be accessible.
Any other questions? Thank you to our panelists for sharing your wisdom. We are considering doing this panel again in the spring. So maybe it's a little better times for the juniors or the parents of juniors who are listening. And also probably, well, their seniors would be gone, but maybe more interesting to sophomore parents as well. So be on the lookout for that. We're thinking about March, but might be closer to April break. And thank you for being here. Thanks, guys. That was great.
Yeah. Did that 6-week thing already happen? I don't know.
The 6-week thing.
The juniors?
It's 10 weeks and it's third quarter.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, the 6 weeks is seniors, and then the sophomores.
Big school, small school, hot weather, cold weather, middle of nowhere.
And that was what it
I can
doesn't
add some of the questions.
You're going to be
cast a wide net.
What line was?
What do you think?
Go see some of each.
And I just one thing like I did want to say,
Just go.
yeah,
Just talking about maybe
Just do it.
because
You can make it fun.
yeah, we had fun.
yeah,
I mean, you know, we were desperate.
there you go.
That's fun.
My husband and I were desperate for our daughter to stay
So I
local.
think,
She's in New Orleans, okay? But we,
I almost went to like where
We get like a
but we did over the COVID Christmas break, we were like so housebound and, you know, so we were like, okay, let's drink some water now and get in the car and drive to Boston, and we're not gonna eat or drink anything until we get home. Well, because we couldn't stop to go to the bathroom, like this was the height of COVID.
Yes.
But we went and we saw Wellesley, Babson, Tufts, and BU. And just like walked around, there was nobody around, it was a ghost town, as you said. But it was like a fun bonding day, and she saw all those schools, and she's like, no, I'm not interested in any of them.
But to walk around,
Yeah.
Yeah.
nice on your
Bentley,
own, and like
Babson,
pop
Tufts are all in the
in,
same area.
Yeah.
pop into the cafeteria or into like I sneak into places. My family is so freaked out, but I was just like, we just want to see this, and like that's kind of a fun way.
It is. Or if the doors are locked, you just slide in behind someone else who's got their badge.
But we kind of,
and we did that at Boston the other day, and my son, and he was really
retiring.
Do you guys have any other
something
questions?
that I didn't think he would get.
Okay.
Oh,
They do surprise you.
Yeah.
How old?
yeah,
What year?
Yeah.
so you're just getting ready.
Fun.
No, it's real. It's totally real.
But my youngest was like that, and she had no problem getting it. She was like,
They'll get
all
it. This
on,
is,
Oh, yeah.
on her phone all the time on Snapchat and Instagram, but trying to get her to go to a college website was like.
so a couple things that I will tell you. Don't, and this is what I tell you.
Yes. So we have two freshman counselors that split the freshman.
Yeah, now we know.
Then
Don't let the noise
Except for
get
us.
full.
permanent counselor.
And I will tell you, the Conard community is actually not like one of those stifling talking about college. I didn't find we didn't talk about it that much with our, the kids were telling me their kids talk about it. But as far as you stay above the fray, like you don't get it about and I know that at other schools,
The parents use that
that's just
and you just like send your emails on the forming
But
based
the reality is, like,
thank you for coming.
and there is a lot of,
the attendance of this.
yeah, oh, my child is going to this.
No problem. No problem.
Blah, 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 blah. There is a lot of competition. So, but just, filter that like you would with anything else.
Well, there's that dance.
You know,
Rather than
one of the things I wish I had